Hi math students, it's Mrs. Marcellus and Einswine. Einswine said he feels so confident dividing decimals by whole numbers after our last lesson that today he'd like to learn how to divide a decimal by a decimal. Guess what, Einswine? You're in luck. Today's learning objective is students will calculate the quotient of two decimal numbers by applying standard algorithms. Our first problem is 2 and 64 hundredths divided by 6 tenths. Do you think we can give this one a try, Einswine? Do you think we should just use the same procedure as we did when we divided decimal by a whole number? Well, let's give it a whirl and see what happens. Just watch, but don't try this at home. The first thing we'll need to do is put the first number, or the dividend, inside the division bracket and put the second number, or the divisor, on the outside of the division bracket. Once we have the problem set up, we look to see how many times can 6 tenths go into 2. That would be 3 times. 3 times 6 tenths is 1.8. Then if we do the subtraction, I'd have to annex a 0 there, and I'd have to borrow, and the result would be 0.2. Then I bring down the next number, and now I want to know how many times will 6 tenths go into 26 hundredths. Well, wait a minute, 6 tenths is larger than 26 hundredths, so now I can't go anywhere. This doesn't seem to be working out too well. In fact, it's impossible to divide a decimal by a decimal without first changing the divisor into a whole number. This process will not work. Thank goodness there's a much easier way. To divide by a decimal, you first must turn the decimal into a whole number. You do this by moving the decimal point to the right the same number of place values in both the divisor and the dividend. In effect, we're multiplying by multiples of 10. We are multiplying both of them by 10 or 100 or 1000, and this allows us to move that decimal point over. What's that, Einswine? Sounds a little confusing, huh? Well, maybe if we do a couple examples, you'll see how easy it is. Let's go back to the problem that we started with. Before we begin dividing, we first must turn the 6 tenths into a 6. I can do this by multiplying the divisor by 10. That would move the decimal place one place to the right. But if I do that, I have to do the same thing to the dividend in order to keep the problem balanced and not change its overall value. So that means the decimal would move one place over in the dividend as well. After moving the decimal point, I always like to rewrite the problem to make sure it's very clear what it is I'm now dividing. I am now dividing 26.4 by 6. You can see that the decimal point moved over one place in each the divisor and the dividend. Now I go ahead and divide. 6 will not go into 2, so I'll put a 0 there. 4 times 6 is 24. I will subtract, bring down the next 4. 4 times 6 is 24. I subtract and have a remainder of 0. Since the problem terminates, the last thing I need to do is put the decimal in the answer. I put the decimal point straight up, and the answer is 4 and 4 tenths. Much easier than trying to divide by 6 tenths, isn't it? Let's try the next problem. As you can see, I have the dividend 11 and 2 tenths inside the bracket and the divisor 7 hundredths outside the bracket. As you know, we can't divide by 7 hundredths. We need to turn that into the whole number 7. In order to do that, we would need to multiply both the dividend and the divisor by 100. This will move the decimal place over 2 places, and here it'd move over 2 places as well. What should I do with that blank spot? Well, as you've learned with addition, subtraction, and multiplication, annexing zeros can be very handy, so we're going to have to annex a 0. The problem that I'm really trying to solve is 1120 divided by 7. I always like to rewrite the problem after moving the decimal point just to make sure I can clearly see what it is I'm trying to do. And I like to put a 0 here as a placeholder because 7 won't go into 1. 7 goes into 11 one time. We'll subtract that. We have 42. 6 times 7 is 42. And we have 0. But we're not done yet because the decimal is here on the right hand side of 1120. That means we still have one unfilled place in the quotient. So we still have to bring that 0 down. 0 times 7 is 0, and now we're done. Our final answer is 160. If you want to check your answer, you can always multiply the divisor times the quotient, or 7 times 160, and check to make sure you get 1120, which we do. Let's move on to a problem that might be a little bit more challenging. The dividend 6/10 goes inside the bracket, and the divisor 24/10,000 goes on the outside of the bracket. It looks kind of strange, doesn't it? That's going to happen sometimes, but you have to remember that the first number, or the divisor, always goes inside the bracket. In order to divide, I need to turn the 24/10,000 into the whole number 24. In order to do that, I will need to multiply by 10,000 and move that decimal 4 places to the right, and now I have the whole number 24. I must do the same thing to the dividend, so I will move my decimal over 1, 2, 3, 4 places, and now it's out here. This means that I need to annex some zeros and fill in those places. This is pretty messy, so again, I always recommend that you rewrite the problem so you can clearly see what you're doing. In this case, we're now dividing 6,000 by 24. We look to see if 24 will go into 6, and we know that it won't, so then we determine how many times will 24 go into 60. It looks to me like that would probably be 2 or 3 times, so you might have to go off to the side and try it out. And I'm going to try 2, and I get 48. So I'll say 2 times 24 is 48, and subtract. That leaves me with 12. I bring down a 0, and I have to try again. In this case, I might think of money. 24 is pretty close to 25, and $1.20 is just about 5 quarters, so why don't we try that? 24 times 5, and that gives me 120 exactly. Woohoo! So I put the 5 in the quotient, I subtract my 120, and that leaves me a remainder of 0. However, I'm not quite finished because the decimal point is to the right of the 6,000, and that means I still have one more space to be filled. I need to bring that last 0 down, and 0 times 24 is 0. And now I am done. My answer is 250. 6/10 divided by 24/10,000 equals 250. As was noted before, there should always be that one-to-one correspondence. You bring a number down, you put a digit up, and you have to keep going until you reach that decimal point. Let's try another example. In this example, we have a whole number divided by a decimal. The first number, 52, goes inside the bracket, and the second number, 4/100, goes outside the bracket. Before I can divide, I must turn 4/100 into the whole number 4. In order to do this, I will need to multiply by 100, which will move the decimal 2 places to the right. And now I have the whole number 4. Because I moved the decimal in the divisor, I must do the same thing in the dividend. The decimal on 52 is to the right of it, so I will need to move 2 more spaces to the right and move the decimal down a little bit further, and then annex those zeros. When I rewrite the problem, I have 5,200 divided by 4. Now I'll just do standard division. 4 goes into 5 one time. I subtract, bring down the next digit, which is 2. 3 times 4 is 12, and after I subtract, I have 0. However, the decimal point is all the way at the end, so that means I still have 2 places that I need to fill. Since everything's a 0, I know that if I continue to bring the zeros down and subtract, that I'll be putting zeros in my quotient. The most important thing is to remember to finish the problem. There's a big difference between an answer of 13 and an answer of 1,300. Let's move on to our final problem. Fred paid $4.90 for 2.5 feet of submarine sandwich. What is the cost of 1 foot of sandwich? The cost of the sandwich, $4.90, will go inside the bracket. It is what is being divided up. It is being divided by 2.5 feet. I can't divide by 2.5, but I can move the decimal over one place to turn that into the whole number 25. If I do that in the divisor, I must move the decimal over one place in the dividend. In effect, I've multiplied both of them by 10. Now I can rewrite my problem. I have 49.0 divided by 25. We're working with money here, and we know that 2 quarters is 50 cents, so 25 will go into 49 only one time. I'll put my placeholder there. 1 times 25 is 25, and then I will subtract, leaving me with 24. I'll bring down the 0, and then I think there are 4 quarters in a dollar, and I have $2. So that's 8 quarters plus a little bit more. So I'm going to try 9. 9 times 25 would be 225. I will subtract that, and I have 15 left. I also know that when I'm working with decimals, I can't have a remainder. So in order to finish the problem, I need to add another 0. $1.50 would be 6 quarters. And 6 times 25 is 150. Now when I subtract, I have a remainder of 0. I can see that Fred paid $1.96 for each foot of his sub sandwich. I don't know about you, but that sub sandwich sure is making me hungry. I think it's time for a snack. As always, if you need additional help, please go to the online math book and check out the tutorial.